Elias Ford, a decorated veteran, faces humiliation at Harvest and Hill Market when clerk Tyler Jensen mocks his service medals as costume jewelry, denying a veteran discount. The sting of disrespect cuts deep, but Elias quietly pays and sits outside, coffee untouched. Unbeknownst to the store, Elias calls General Raymond Hail, a retired four-star general and old comrade. As Hail arrives, the atmosphere shifts. His commanding presence and imminent action promise a reckoning. Will the store face consequences? Will respect be restored? The stage is set for a powerful confrontation that could change everything. If this story touched you, join us in honoring veterans like Elias Ford. Subscribe, like, and share to amplify their stories. Your support keeps their legacy alive. Comment with your own experiences to inspire others. Together, let's stand for those who served. Thank you for remembering. The sharp words cut through the hum of the Harvest and Hill Market like a blade through fog. Sir, those are just costume jewelry, right? You don't seriously expect a discount for that? Tyler Jensen's voice carried a smirk, his eyes barely flicking toward the faded medals pinned to Elias Ford's weather jacket. The young cashier's tone dripped with casual disdain, as if the very idea of those tarnished bits of metal holding any weight was laughable. Elias, steadying himself with a hand on his oak cane, felt the familiar ache in his left leg pulse in time with his heartbeat. He didn't flinch. His response came soft, almost too quiet for the bustling store. They're not costumes. They mark 30 years of service. His voice was steady, but inside a flicker of something raw stirred. Pride, maybe, or the dull burn of being unseen. Tyler's eyes rolled, a gesture so quick it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. Sure they do, full price. Elias didn't argue. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few crumpled bills, and paid in silence. The transaction was over in seconds, but the weight of it lingered as he stepped outside. He settled onto a worn wooden bench just beyond the market's glass doors, the coffee cup in his hand growing cold. It wasn't about the money, it never was. It was the sting of being dismissed, of having a lifetime of sacrifice reduced to a flippant remark. The medals, pinned carefully inside his jacket, weren't for show. They were for him, a quiet tether to a past that still haunted his dreams, to men who never came home, to a version of himself that once stood taller, unbowed by time or shrapnel. He stared at the steam rising from the untouched coffee, his thoughts drifting to places he rarely allowed them to go. Inside the market, the cheerful jazz that had been looping through the speakers abruptly stopped. A pause, heavy and expectant, filled the air. Then a voice broke through, deep and commanding, slicing through the chatter of shoppers and the clatter of carts. Attention all patrons and staff of Harvest and Hill Market. This is General Raymond Hail. The words hung like a storm cloud, undeniable, pulling every head in the store toward the source. The air grew still, charged with something unspoken. Respect wasn't just coming, it was already here, and it didn't need permission to take up space. Elias Ford had left the battlefield decades ago, but the war never fully released its grip on him. He lived in a modest third-floor apartment in an aging brick building, the kind where the elevator groaned and the hallway smelled faintly of mildew. The walls of his small home were a testament to a life of discipline and reflection, lined with books, mostly history, their spines creased from years of careful study. A few dog-eared volumes on military strategy sat among them, their margins filled with notes scrawled in a younger man's hand, back when he believed wars could be won with enough planning and grit. Above his desk, a single-framed photograph held pride of place, a unit of young soldiers, their faces alight with the reckless optimism of youth, frozen in a moment before the world taught them otherwise. Most of those men never made it back. Elias didn't need to look at the photo to see their faces. They were etched into his memory, as vivid as the day the shutter clicked. Every morning Elias rose at 5, his body wired to an old soldier's rhythm. The habit was unbreakable, even if the world no longer demanded it. He brewed our own, tiered strong black coffee, the kind that could wake a man from a coma, and sat at his kitchen table with a copy of Stars and Stripes, or whatever newspaper the corner store still carried. The morning light would spill through the window, painting the room in soft golds and grays, And for a moment, he could almost forget the ache in his leg, a permanent memento from a roadside bomb in Kandahar. He never spoke of this pain, not to the doctors at the VA, not to the other veterans he met in the waiting room. To Elias, pain was just another kind of silence, something to endure without comment. His cane, carved from solid oak with a leather-wrapped grip, was more than a tool to keep him steady. It was a companion, weathered and reliable, having seen him through 2 hospitalizations and a recovery that felt like climbing a mountain with no summit. He'd turned down offers of newer lightweight models, aluminum canes with ergonomic handles and adjustable heights. They felt wrong, like shaking hands with a stranger. This cane had history, had borne witness to his struggle. His orthopedic shoes, on the other hand, were purely practical, though he hated their clunky necessity. Every step to the store was a calculated mission, a test of balance and endurance, his body a battlefield of its own. Most days, Elias made the trek to the local VA clinic, where he'd pick up prescriptions and exchange quiet nods with other veterans. They were a community bound by unspoken understanding, men and women who knew what it meant to come home but never quite feel at home. In the waiting room, a single glance could carry more weight than an hour of conversation with someone who'd never served. Elias never demanded attention or special treatment. He waited his turn, his patience a kind of armor. That morning had begun like any other, with a slight chill in the air and the familiar routine. Boots laced by 6, his khaki jacket pressed and ready. But there was something heavier in the air, a quiet weight he couldn't shake. It was the anniversary of Operation Panther Ridge, one of the last missions he'd led before retirement. A brutal campaign, one that had carved deep lines into his soul. Lives were lost, good men, men he'd promised to bring home. The guilt still lingered, a shadow that grew longer on days like this. On impulse, he'd pinned a small row of service ribbons inside his coat, hidden from view. They weren't for anyone else, just a private act of remembrance, a way to carry the weight of that day with him. He hadn't been looking for recognition when he stepped into the Harvest and Hill market. All he wanted was a warm cup of coffee and a quiet corner to skim the headlines, to let the world pass by for a moment. The market itself was a world apart, a glossy haven in a neighborhood that was shedding its old skin for something shinier. It wasn't just a grocery store, it was a curated experience, with shelves stocked with organic produce, artisan breads, and teas with names no one could pronounce, but everyone felt sophisticated owning. The pendant lights cast a warm glow and the air smelled of fresh sourdough and citrus, underscored by the soft hum of jazz. To Elias, it felt like stepping into a foreign country, one where he was a visitor, not a resident. Still, he liked the quiet of it, the way you could move through the aisles without drawing attention. He wasn't there for the imported teas or the overpriced apples. He just wanted a moment of peace. But peace, like respect, had a way of arriving when you least expected it, unannounced, uninvited, and sometimes wearing stars. Elias Ford moved through the world with the weight of decades on his shoulders, each step deliberate, his cane a quiet companion tapping against the polished floor of Harvest and Hill Market. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh-baked sourdough, a blend of comfort and commerce. His coat, buttoned modestly but not entirely, allowed just enough of his service ribbons to peek through, a subtle display of pride, not for show but for himself. The placard by the door had caught his eye as he entered. "We honor those who serve. Ask at checkout for senior and veteran discounts." It was a small gesture, but it mattered to a man who had given 30 years to a cause larger than himself. He wasn't here for the discount alone, but for the acknowledgement, the nod to a life spent in service. The coffee, he'd heard, was strong and worth the price, a small indulgence for a man who rarely allowed himself such things. At the counter, Elias stood tall despite the ache in his joints, his posture a testament to years of discipline. Behind the register was Tyler, a young man in his early 20s, his angular haircut and fitted black shirt screaming youthful indifference beneath the store's green apron. His name tag, bold and sans serif, declared Tyler, with the same unapologetic clarity as his demeanor. To Tyler, this was just another shift, another customer, another transaction to punch into the register without much thought. Eye contact was a chore he didn't bother with, and his customer service, seemed to depend on his mood, which today leaned toward apathy. Elias offered a polite nod, his voice steady but warm. "Just a large black coffee, please." His words carried the quiet authority of someone who had given orders and followed them, someone who knew the value of civility. Tyler barely looked up, his fingers tapping lazily at the register, distracted by something. Maybe his phone, maybe his own thoughts. "That'll be $4.75, he said, his tone flat, already moving on in his mind. Elias reached into his worn leather wallet, his fingers brushing against the edges of his Veterans Administration ID card, its corners softened from years of careful handling. He slid it across the counter, opening his coat just enough to reveal the neat row of miniature service ribbons pinned to his chest. They weren't flashy, but they told a story, each one a chapter of sacrifice, courage, and loss. "I believe there's a veterans discount," he said, his voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that invited no argument but didn't demand one either. Tyler's eyes flicked to the card, then to the ribbons, and something shifted in his expression. His lip curled slightly, not quite a sneer, but close enough to sting. He tilted his head, squinting as if trying to decipher a puzzle. "These," he said, gesturing vaguely at the ribbons with a dismissive wave. "Sir, those are just like costume jewelry, right?" The words landed like a slap, casual but cutting, delivered with the careless arrogance of youth. Elias didn't respond immediately. His hand paused on the counter, the ID card still resting there, a silent testament to his truth. Inside, a storm churned. 30 years of service reduced to costume jewelry by someone who hadn't lived long enough to understand what those ribbons meant. He felt the weight of every mission, every sleepless night, every friend he'd buried, pressing against his chest. But Elias was not a man to erupt. He adjusted his posture, standing a little straighter, and when he spoke, his voice was even, measured. "They represent 30 years of service." Tyler scoffed, a sound that grated against the hum of the store. "Sure, gumball prizes," he said, waving his hand as if brushing away a fly. "That doesn't change the price. We need a real military ID for the discount, not whatever this thing is." His words were loud enough to ripple through the nearby aisles, and for a fleeting moment the store seemed to hold its breath. A woman arranging tulips at a display froze, her hands hovering over the vibrant petals, her eyes darting toward the counter before quickly looking away. A man with a cart brimming with kombucha bottles glanced up, his brow furrowing, but he said nothing. An older couple in the bread aisle exchanged a look, sensing the tension, but they too chose silence, their hands tightening on their basket. Elias stood unmoving, his face a mask of composure, but inside the insult burned. It wasn't just the words, it was the dismissal, the mockery of something he'd carried with pride and pain for decades. He didn't plead or raise his voice. "That's a valid federal ID," he said simply, "and those medals were earned." His tone was steady, but there was a quiet fire beneath it, the kind that comes from a man who has faced worse than a flippant cashier and come out the other side. Tyler rolled his eyes, his fingers tapping the register screen harder this time, as if the machine could absorb his irritation. "Well, it's still full price unless you want to talk to corporate about your souvenir pins." The sarcasm was unmistakable, each word dripping with disdain. From the manager's booth just a few feet away, Dana Whitmore looked up from her laptop. Her sleek black blazer and oversized glasses gave her an air of authority, but her gaze lingered on the scene for only a moment before returning to her spreadsheet. She saw it all, the ID, the ribbons, the exchange, but chose to say nothing. Her silence was louder than Tyler's words, a tacit approval of the disrespect unfolding before her. The air grew heavy, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest. Elias nodded once, slowly, his jaw tight. He reached into his pocket, his hand trembling, not from age or weakness, but from the restraint it took to keep his anger in check. He counted out exact change, each coin and bill placed deliberately on the counter, a small act of dignity in the face of indignity. Tyler handed him the coffee cup and receipt with a performative smile, his voice oozing mockery. "Have a nice day, Sergeant," he said, the title twisted into something hollow. Elias turned away, his cane clicking softly against the polished concrete floor as he made his way past shelves of granola and gluten-free crackers to a small seating area near the window. The coffee steamed in his hand, its warmth a stark contrast to the coldness he felt inside. He sat with his back straight, his jaw set, his eyes unfocused, staring at nothing. The bitterness of the coffee was nothing compared to the taste in his mouth now, a mix of disappointment, anger, and something deeper, something that cut to the core of who he was. Around him, the store moved on as if nothing had happened. Conversations resumed, soft jazz filled the air, and the hum of daily life continued. But for Elias, something had shifted. It wasn't just the insult, it was what it represented. A young man could look at the symbols of his service and see only decoration, could mock the sacrifices woven into each ribbon. A manager could witness quiet cruelty and choose the safety of her spreadsheet over intervention. And the people around them, those who enjoyed the freedoms others had bled for, could stand by and say nothing. Their silence a different kind of wound. Elias Ford had lived long enough to know that disrespect wore many faces. Some were loud, like Tyler's careless sarcasm. Some were quiet, like Dana's averted gaze. But all of them, every single one, deserved to be answered. He looked down at the coffee cup, then at the medals pinned to his chest, each one a memory of a life he'd lived, a price he'd paid. Maybe today wouldn't be so quiet after all. Outside, Elias sat on the cold metal bench beside Harvest and Hill Market, its sleek design more aesthetic than comfortable, flanked by neatly trimmed hedges and overpriced succulents. The coffee sat untouched in his hand, steam rising into the crisp air. His eyes traced the horizon, but his mind was elsewhere, grappling with the weight of what had just transpired. The world moved on around him, but for Elias, the moment lingered, a reminder that some battles never truly end. The coffee cup sat cooling on the bench beside Elias Ford, untouched since the young clerk, Tyler, had handed it over with a careless shrug that felt like a slap. Elias's cane rested between his knees, its worn wooden handle cradled in his hands, his knuckles pale from the quiet strength of his grip. Anger, the kind that flared hot and loud in others, wasn't his way. He'd never been one to raise his voice or demand attention in a crowded room. That wasn't how he carried himself, not after decades of discipline forged in places where chaos reigned. But today, something had fractured inside him during that brief, stinging exchange at Harvest and Hill Market. It wasn't just his pride that had been bruised. It was something deeper, a wound tied to the weight of years spent carrying the names of men who'd never made it home. The cost of nights spent under fire, the ache of standing at gravesides under gray skies. The ribbons pinned to his coat pressed heavier against his chest, their colors muted under the fluorescent lights but vivid in his memory. His fingers drifted upward, gently nudging a bronze star back into place, its slight tilt bothering him more than it should. To a boy like Tyler, barely old enough to shave, those medals were shiny trinkets, meaningless props. To Elias, they were fragments of a life, each one a story of sacrifice, of brothers lost, of moments when survival felt like a debt he could never repay. He exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that carried the weight of his thoughts, and reached into his pocket for his flip phone. It was a relic, sturdy and unpretentious, its scratched surface a testament to years of reliability. Like Elias himself, it was built to endure, not to impress. Flipping it open, he scrolled through the short list of contacts, his thumb pausing over one labeled simply, Hail, General Reg. The name stirred memories of smoke-filled battlefields, of quiet moments in command tents, of laughter shared over glasses of scotch at reunions where only those who'd seen the same hell could understand. He hadn't dialed that number in years, not since Raymond Hail's retirement ceremony, where they'd stood under a sky bruised with twilight, trading stories too heavy for civilian ears. Not since the last reunion, where the clink of glasses had masked the ache of absences felt but never spoken. General Raymond Hail, 4 stars, combat veteran, former commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, was a man who'd walked through fire beside Elias, a man whose steady presence could anchor a soldier in the worst of storms. When Raymond had retired, he'd pressed a card into Elias's hand with a promise that felt like a vow. If the world ever forgets who you are, call me. Anytime, anywhere. Elias had tucked it away, certain he'd never need to use it. But today, the clerk's flippant words, the manager's indifferent silence, had left a mark he couldn't shake. His thumb hovered, then pressed the call button, his heart a quiet drumbeat beneath his steady exterior. The phone rang twice before a voice answered, gravelly, firm, alert despite the years that had passed. Ray Hail. The sound of it grounded Elias, pulling him back to a time when trust was forged in shared hardship. General, it's Elias Ford. Sergeant Major Ford, from Panther Ridge, he said, his voice even but threaded with a tremor he couldn't fully conceal. A pause stretched across the line, brief but heavy, before warmth broke through like sunlight piercing a storm. Elias, good Lord, it's damn good to hear your voice. You all right? Raymond's tone was familiar, steady, but sharp enough to catch the undercurrent of pain in Elias's words. I'm mostly all right, sir, Elias replied, his voice calm but raw at the edges. He recounted the incident with the precision of a mission debrief. The store, the clerk's careless jab about his medals being fancy pins, the manager's refusal to step in, her eyes fixed on her laptop as if Elias were a nuisance. He didn't exaggerate, didn't seek pity. Revenge wasn't his aim, nor was an apology. What he needed was simpler, yet harder to name. Someone who understood what those ribbons meant. Someone who knew the weight of their cost. Raymond listened in silence, the kind of silence that carried its own gravity, the kind only a man who'd stood in the same fire could offer. Then his voice cut through, sharp and resolute. You still there, Elias? Yes, sir. Good. Don't move. I'm 2 blocks from that store. Meeting the mayor in 20, but that can wait. Stay where you are. 10 minutes. The line went dead, abrupt but certain. Elias lowered the phone, his eyes fixed on its worn keypad, the faint scratches catching the light. The call had lasted barely 3 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime compressed into a few words. He knew with the same instinct that had once guided him through the dark to field strip a rifle, that something was about to change. Inside Harvest and Hill Market, the chime of the front door barely stirred the steady rhythm of shoppers drifting through aisles of organic produce and artisanal goods. It rang dozens of times a day, a familiar note in the store's humdrum symphony. But this time the air seemed to shift, charged with a quiet intensity that made heads turn without knowing why. General Raymond Hail stepped through the doorway, his presence commanding in a way that didn't rely on the uniform he had left behind years ago. His navy suit, tailored to his broad shoulders, was pressed to razor-sharp precision, his silver hair swept back with the discipline of a man who'd never let details slip. His posture carried the weight of decades spent leading, soldiers, missions, lives entrusted to his care. His eyes, still piercing after years away from command, swept the store with the focus that felt almost tangible. They weren't clouded by anger or softened by nostalgia, but honed with a purpose that was both calm and unrelenting, like a general stepping onto a battlefield disguised as a polished market floor. He moved with measured steps, his polished loafers clicking softly against the tiled floor, bypassing the salad bar's bright greens and the kombucha fridge's pastel glow. His destination was clear, the manager's station at the back of the store. Donna Whitmore, the manager, was bent over her laptop, her fingers tapping out a report when she sensed his approach. She glanced up, her hazel eyes widening as she registered the man before her. Not a typical customer, not a delivery driver, but someone whose presence demanded attention without a word. Hello, she said, her voice cautious, her fingers freezing mid-keystroke. Excuse me, Raymond said, his tone firm, but tempered with a courtesy that didn't dilute its authority. I need access to your intercom system. Immediately. Dana blinked, her brow furrowing. I'm sorry, who are you? Who are you? She asked, her voice tinged with unease. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into his jacket and produced a leather wallet, flipping it open with a practiced motion. Inside was a military ID, retired but unmistakable, alongside a card bearing the seal of a Veterans Foundation, his name etched beside 4 stars and a Department of Defense insignia. I'm General Raymond Hail, retired, he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that brooked no argument. I'm here on behalf of a veteran who was humiliated in this store 20 minutes ago. I'd like to address your customers. The air in Harvest and Hill Market grew heavy, charged with a tension that seemed to still the world itself. General Raymond Hail stood behind the admin counter, his hands steady as it hovered over the store's PA system. The mic, a relic of simpler days, rested beside the register, and with a flicker of muscle memory from years of command, he pressed the button. A sharp burst of static cut through the soft jazz overhead, silencing it. The kind of silence that stops people in their tracks, mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-thought, blanketed the store. Every eye turned, searching for the source of the disruption. "This is General Raymond Hail," his voice boomed, rich and resonant, filling every corner of the market with an authority that needed no amplification. It was the voice of a man who had led soldiers through chaos, who had faced down fear and uncertainty with unyielding resolve. "Attention, all patrons and staff of Harvest and Hill Market. I am on these premises today because one of your own, Sergeant Major Elias Ford, a decorated war veteran, was disrespected at your counter. He presented the medals he earned through decades of service to this nation, and he was mocked for it." The store froze. A cashier's hand hovered over a barcode scanner, her fingers trembling as she forgot the can of soup in her grip. A father carefully selecting oranges for his family paused, his brow furrowing as the weight of the words settled over him. Somewhere near the coffee aisle, Tyler Jensen, a young clerk who had been chuckling about the old guy with the fake medals moments before, felt his breath catch. His easy grin vanished, replaced by a creeping dread that coiled in his chest. He stood rooted by the espresso machine, his coworker edging away as if to distance herself from the storm brewing in his direction. Hale's voice continued, steady and deliberate, each word carrying the gravity of a man who had seen too much to tolerate injustice. "Sergeant Major Ford served this country with distinction for over 30 years. He carries the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart. Not trinkets from a costume shop, but honors earned in combat zones most of you will never know. Today he asked for a modest veteran's discount, one you openly advertise, and in return he was ridiculed." The silence deepened, so profound you could almost hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. Customers exchanged glances, some with cheeks flushed in shame, others with eyes narrowed in quiet anger. A mother tightened her grip on her son's hand, her heart sinking as she thought of her own father, a veteran who had never spoken of his service but carried its weight in his quiet demeanor. An older man near the produce section clenched his jaw, his mind flashing to friends lost in wars long past, their sacrifices now seemingly trivialized in this fluorescent-lit market. Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone was a blade, sharp and precise, cutting through the apathy that had allowed this moment to unfold. A clerk called his medals gumball prizes. A manager stood by and did nothing. "I am not here to make a spectacle. I am here to right a wrong." His words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the crowd. No one dared move. The jazz music, usually a cheerful backdrop, remained absent, as if the store itself held its breath. Tyler Jensen's heart pounded so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. The swagger he'd worn earlier, that cocky assurance of youth, had evaporated. His face was pale, his hands clammy as they gripped the counter. He wanted to shrink, to disappear into the floor, but there was no escape from the general's gaze. His co-worker, sensing the weight of the moment, stepped back further, her eyes wide with a mix of guilt and relief that she hadn't been the one to speak those careless words. Donna Whitmore, the store manager, approached slowly, her tablet clutched tightly to her chest like a flimsy shield. Her mind raced, replaying the moment she'd seen Elias Ford at the counter, his medals glinting under the harsh store lights. She'd noticed Tyler's smirk, heard his flippant comment, but she'd turned away, distracted by inventory reports and the endless demands of her job. Now her stomach churned with regret. She opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling. "General Hail, He raised a hand, not in anger, but with a calm authority that silenced her before she could form an excuse. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice even but unyielding, "you saw what happened. You chose your spreadsheet over your responsibility." Dana's lips parted, then closed. Her face burned with shame, the weight of her inaction pressing down on her. She wanted to explain, to justify, but the general's gaze held her accountable in a way no corporate reprimand ever could. She felt small, exposed, as if every customer's stare was a judgment on her failure. Hale turned to Tyler, his eyes narrowing slightly, though his voice remained steady. "And you," he said, each word deliberate, "mocked a combat veteran's medals in front of others. You belittled 30 years of sacrifice as if it were a joke. Ignorance is not an excuse for contempt." Tyler's mouth went dry. "Sir, I didn't mean," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You said gumball prizes," Hale cut in, his tone flat, leaving no room for denial. "Let's not pretend this was a misunderstanding." Behind them, a small crowd had gathered. Some shoppers pulled out their phones, recording the scene with quiet reverence, as if they were witnessing history unfold in the aisles of a grocery store. Others stood silent, their expressions a mix of awe and discomfort. The market had become a courtroom, and respect itself was on trial. At that moment, a younger employee, barely out of his teens, appeared at the entrance, escorting an older man back into the store. Elias Ford walked slowly, his cane tapping softly against the tiled floor. His face was weathered, etched with the lines of a life spent in service, but his eyes held a quiet dignity that no insult could diminish. The young employee had overheard Hale's speech and, perhaps driven by guilt or a flicker of decency, had gone to find him. As Elias entered, the general's stern expression softened, a flicker of warmth breaking through his disciplined demeanor. "Sergeant Major," Hale said, his voice gentler now, "I'm sorry this happened to you, but I assure you it will not go unanswered." He gestured for Elias to stand beside him, a silent invitation to reclaim the respect that had been stolen. Elias hesitated, his hand tightening on his cane, his heart heavy with a mix of gratitude and lingering hurt. He hadn't asked for this attention, hadn't wanted to be the center of a scene, but the general's resolve gave him strength. Hale turned back to Dana and Tyler, his gaze steady. "First, you will offer Sergeant Major Ford a direct, unequivocal, and public apology. Not because I demand it, but because it is right." Tyler's throat tightened as he forced himself to step forward, his boots scuffing against the polished floor of Harvest and Hill Market. His heart pounded, a mix of shame and fear swirling in his chest like a storm he couldn't outrun. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice low and unsteady, "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I shouldn't have said what I did. It was wrong." The words felt heavy, inadequate, like trying to patch a gaping wound with a single bandage. He avoided Elias Ford's eyes, unable to face the man whose service he'd mocked just hours earlier. The weight of his ignorance pressed down on him, a silent accusation that made his skin prickle with regret. Dana, standing beside him, shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks flushed with a heat that came more from embarrassment than genuine remorse. Her hands fidgeted at her sides, fingers twisting the hem of her apron as she spoke. "Mr. Ford," she began, her voice trembling, "I apologize for what you experienced here today. It doesn't reflect our values as a company." The words sounded rehearsed, like something she'd been trained to say in a crisis, but they lacked the warmth of sincerity. Inside, she was reeling, her mind racing with thoughts of lost sales and the inevitable gossip that would spread among her coworkers. She wanted to shrink away, to hide from the piercing gaze of the man who stood silently before her. Elias Ford gave a small nod, his face unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His silence was louder than any words could have been, a quiet dignity that filled the room and made everyone feel smaller in its presence. His eyes, weathered by years of service and sacrifice, held a depth that Tyler and Dana couldn't begin to fathom. In that moment, he wasn't just a customer who'd been wronged. He was a living testament to battles fought, losses endured, and a strength that demanded respect without ever asking for it. Second General Hale's voice cut through the tension, commanding the attention of everyone in the store. "This store," he declared, his tone firm yet measured, "will be making a donation of $25 for every 1,000 in sales to the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans in the name of Sergeant Major Elias Ford. My office will oversee the transfer. That amount is non-negotiable." His words landed like a gavel, final and unyielding. Dana's eyes widened, her breath catching as the figure sank in. $25 per thousand was no small sum. It was a statement, a demand for accountability that stung her pride. She wanted to argue, to point out the financial strain, but the general's presence silenced her before she could even try. It's a significant sum, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, but Hale's response was swift and sharp. It's also the cost of dignity. Consider it restitution. His words were a blade cutting through her excuses. Then raising his voice so it carried to every corner of the store, he continued. And third, this store is now closed for the day. Gasps rippled through the employees and lingering customers, a collective shock that seemed to suck the air from the room. Dana's jaw tightened, her mind racing with thoughts of lost revenue during peak hours. Tyler, meanwhile, felt his stomach drop, wishing he could melt into the floor and escape the consequences of his careless words. Hale didn't pause for objections. Every staff member will report to the conference room in 15 minutes, he said, his voice leaving no room for debate. You will attend a mandatory sensitivity and veteran respect training session, led by a retired Marine gunnery sergeant I personally selected. Respect can be taught, and clearly, it must be. His gaze swept the room, lingering on Tyler, whose face burned under the scrutiny. Dana opened her mouth, a protest forming. But sir, this is peak business hours. But Hale's response was immediate, his tone like steel. Then consider today your cost of education. You can reopen tomorrow, hopefully better. Without waiting for agreement, the general turned to Elias, his demeanor softening as he placed a gentle hand on the sergeant major's shoulder. I told you, Sergeant Major. Anytime, anywhere, he said, his voice carrying a warmth and conviction that spoke of a bond forged in shared sacrifice. Elias's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a quiet gratitude, a recognition of the loyalty that had brought them to this moment. And for Elias, this wasn't about vengeance or public shaming. It was about restoring something deeper, something that had been chipped away by careless words in a place that should have been safe. The doors of Harvest and Hill Market remained locked for the rest of the day. The usual hum of activity, customers browsing, registers beeping, soft music drifting through the aisles, was replaced by an eerie silence. Inside the break room, typically a space for hurried lunches or mundane HR videos, the staff sat in neat rows, their postures rigid, notebooks open, eyes fixed on the man at the front. Master Gunnery Sergeant Robert Gunny Torres, retired Marine, stood before them. His presence was commanding, not because of his size or volume, but because of the weight of his 40 years of service. Every line on his face, every measured word he spoke, carried the authority of a life dedicated to something greater than himself. This isn't just about Elias Ford, Gunny began, his voice steady and clear, slicing through the air like a well-aimed shot. It's about every man and woman who served, who walked through fire and came back with less than they left with. Sometimes that loss is visible. Scars, missing limbs, wheelchairs. Sometimes it's not. Nightmares, memories, things they'll never speak of. Your job as citizens, as people who profit from the freedom their sacrifice bought, is to honor it. His words weren't loud, but they carried a force that made every employee sit up straighter, their indifference crumbling under the weight of his truth. The training session stretched over 4 hours, but it wasn't just a lecture. Gunny wove stories into his teaching, stories of soldiers who carried their comrades through battle, of families who waited years for loved ones who never returned, of veterans who struggled to find their place in a world that often forgot them. He spoke of the medals, the ribbons, the silent costs carried home in the hearts of those who served. He passed around a small plaque listing the most common combat awards and their meanings, and when it reached Tyler, he held it longer than the others. His fingers traced the engraving of the Bronze Star, his mind replaying his earlier scoff at such honors. Shame twisted in his gut, a quiet realization that he'd mocked something sacred, something he could never fully understand. By the end of the session, even the most apathetic employees were subdued, their thoughts heavier, their perspectives shifted. Tyler, who had been so quick to dismiss Elias's service that morning, sat in silence, his usual bravado gone. He didn't fidget, didn't check his phone, didn't whisper to his coworkers. The stories Gunny told lingered in his mind, painting vivid images of sacrifice and resilience that made his own complaints seem trivial. Dana, too, felt the weight of the moment. Her initial frustration at the store's closure had given way to a grudging respect, not for the general's authority, but for the humanity of the stories she'd heard. When the market reopened the next day, a new sign greeted customers at the entrance. We proudly offer 15% off for all active duty and veteran customers. Thank you for your service. Below, in smaller text, it read, "In honor of Sergeant Major Elias Ford." The community's response was swift and overwhelming. Local news stations picked up the story, their headlines bold. Retired General shuts down market over veteran insult. A clip of General Hail's intercom speech spread like wildfire across social media, shared by veterans groups, military families, and ordinary people who saw in it a stand for dignity. Letters flooded the store, notes of gratitude, stories from veterans who felt seen for the first time in years. Veterans from nearby towns began to shop at the market, some driving hours just to stand in the aisles and feel the respect that now permeated the space. Parents brought their children, pointing to a cardboard cutout of Elias Ford near the checkout line, where a small biography detailed his service. The cutout wasn't just a gesture, it was a reminder, a quiet promise that what had happened would not be forgotten. Tyler remained on staff, his job spared by General Hail's decision not to demand his dismissal. But he carried himself differently now, his usual swagger tempered by a newfound awareness. He didn't speak of the training session, but the way he paused to read the biography on Elias's cutout said more than words ever could. For Elias, the changes at the market were more than restitution. They were a restoration of faith. He'd walked into the store that day expecting nothing more than groceries, but he'd left with something far greater. A reminder that his service, his sacrifices, still mattered. And for General Hail, it was a promise kept, a vow to stand by his brother in arms anytime, anywhere. The market, once just a place of transactions, had become something more. A place where respect was relearned, where dignity was reclaimed, and where the silent costs of service were finally given a voice. The late afternoon sun hung low, painting the sidewalk outside Harvest and Hill Market in hues of amber and gold. General Raymond Hail and Sergeant Major Elias Ford stepped out of the store, their boots striking the pavement in a rhythm born of years in uniform. The air was crisp, the storm of the past week, both literal and figurative, having finally cleared. Neither man spoke as they walked side by side, their silence a testament to a bond forged in the crucible of war. Words weren't always necessary between soldiers. Sometimes the steady presence of a brother in arms was enough to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. 2 blocks down, they found their destination, a small, unpretentious cafe with weathered brick walls and peeling paint that gave it a lived-in charm. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and home-cooked meals wafted out as they pushed open the door, greeted by the soft jingle of a bell. Inside, the place felt like a refuge from the world. Simple, honest, with checkered tablecloths and a waitress who called everyone sir or ma'am with genuine warmth. She led them to a table by the window where the fading light cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Hale didn't bother with the menu. 2 plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, he said, his voice steady but warm, already knowing Elias's preferences after years of shared meals in mess halls and makeshift camps. The waitress nodded and disappeared, leaving the 2 men to settle into the quiet hum of the diner. For a while they spoke like old friends do, not rushing, letting each word land with the weight it deserved. Their conversation meandered through memories, pausing at the edges of pain and pride. "You remember Panther Ridge?" Elias asked, his voice low as he stirred sugar into his coffee, using the handle of his spoon out of habit. His eyes, though steady, held a flicker of something distant, as if he were seeing the jagged cliffs and smoke-filled air of that long-ago battlefield. Hale nodded, his expression tightening. "Lost 6 good men that day. You dragged Sergeant Montoya out under fire. Still don't know how you managed that with a busted knee." Elias's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Montoya weighed less than my gear back then." They both let out a soft chuckle, but the sound faded quickly, swallowed by the gravity of the memory. Elias's gaze drifted to the window where the world outside moved on, cars passing, people laughing, oblivious to the scars carried by men like him. "I think about them," he said, his voice quieter now, almost confessional. "The ones who didn't come home. Every morning, really. And then something like today happens, and I wonder, Did the world just forget? Hale set his fork down, leaning back in his chair. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, met Elias's across the table. No, he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too much to lie. It forgets sometimes, sure, but it hasn't moved on. Not when there are men like you still carrying their memory. Not while I'm still breathing. The words landed like a lifeline, and for a moment Elias felt the knot in his chest loosen. He'd spent so many years carrying the weight of those lost friends, brothers, faces he could still see as clearly as the day they'd fallen. The incident at the market, the careless words of a young cashier named Tyler, had stirred that old pain, making him question whether the sacrifices he'd made, the lives he'd fought for, meant anything to a world that seemed to have moved on. But Hale's words reminded him that he wasn't alone in that fight. Hale reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather folder, sleek, well-worn, and practical, like everything he carried. Inside was a print packet, a card, and a contact list, all neatly organized. This, he said, sliding it across the table, is from my foundation. We've got a team, VA claims advisors, housing support, peer counselors, no red tape, no waiting lists. You call and they act. Elias raised an eyebrow, his pride bristling faintly. I get all my meds on time, he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. Don't need a handout. Hale's smile was knowing, the kind that came from understanding a man's stubborn heart. It's not a handout, Elias, it's a lifeline. We both know too many who slip through the cracks. I'm making damn sure you're not one of them. Elias looked at the folder, then back at Hale. His fingers rested on the leather, feeling its worn texture, a tangible reminder of the man across from him who'd never stopped fighting for his people. You always were better at the politics, he said, a hint of teasing in his voice. Hale's tone softened, but his resolve didn't waver. And you were always the reason the rest of us came back in one piece, us. They fell into silence again, eating slowly as the diner's hum wrapped around them, clinking dishes, soft laughter from another table, the faint crackle of a radio in the kitchen. The meatloaf was warm, the mashed potatoes creamy, and for a moment it felt like they were back in simpler times, sharing a meal after a long march. But the weight of their shared history was never far, a quiet companion at the table. As they stood to leave, Hale clasped Elias's shoulder with a grip that spoke louder than words. No one gets left behind, he said, his voice low and fierce. Not on my watch. Elias didn't reply, but the quiet nod he gave was answer enough. For all the pain he'd carried, for all the mornings he'd woken with the ghosts of fallen friends, there was now one unshakable certainty. He wasn't alone anymore. The folder in his hand felt heavier than it should, not with burden, but with possibility. A week later, the entrance to Harvest and Hill Market looked transformed. Where once there had been only promotional flyers and sale signs, now a bulletin board stood proudly, displaying a profile of a local veteran, updated monthly, as Dana Whitmore, the store's manager, had promised. Dana, a woman whose sharp business acumen was matched only by her newfound resolve, had felt the sting of the incident deeply. She hadn't demanded Tyler's firing, though the thought had crossed her mind in the heat of the moment. Instead, she'd seen an opportunity for change, for growth, not just for her store, but for her community. Her regret was palpable in the days that followed. She'd lain awake at night, replaying the moment she'd learned of Elias's service, his silver star, his quiet dignity in the face of disrespect. It shouldn't have taken a public outcry, she thought, to make her see what had been right in front of her, but she was determined to make it right. She'd instituted a permanent annual training program for all new hires, led by veterans from the local community, teaching not just recognition, but respect, deep, meaningful respect for those who'd served. In an interview with the local news, her voice had trembled with conviction. It should never have taken this, she said, but we're not going backward. Not ever again. Tyler, the young cashier whose thoughtless words had sparked the incident, had felt the weight of his mistake like a stone in his chest. He'd been brash, careless, caught up in the rush of a busy day, but the aftermath had shaken him. He'd read about Elias's silver star late one night, the article glowing on his phone screen, and the realization of who Elias was, what he'd done, had hit him like a punch. The next time Elias came to the market for his usual quiet cup of coffee, Tyler had approached him, his hands trembling slightly as he set the cup down. "No charge," he said, his voice soft but earnest. "And I read about the silver star, sir. I didn't know." Elias had looked up, his expression unreadable for a moment, a flicker of wariness in his eyes. Then he nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Knowing now is what matters." Tyler had walked away from that moment changed, his steps a little heavier, his perspective a little broader. He'd always been quick to speak, quick to move, but now he carried a quiet resolve to listen, to learn, to be better. Elias, too, felt something shift. He hadn't wanted an apology, hadn't needed one, but the sincerity in Tyler's eyes had eased a small part of the ache he'd carried since that day. Something had changed, not just in the policies of a small-town market, but in the people who walked its aisles. Because one man, quiet and dignified, had chosen to break his silence. Because one general, long retired but never truly done with his mission, had refused to let a brother fall. And because a community, flawed but willing, had decided to listen. The sun might have set on that day, but the light it left behind lingered, a quiet promise of something better. To the right of the automatic sliding doors, where the hum of shoppers blended with the soft chime of the entry, a new sign hung proudly, framed in rich, dark oak. Bathed in the warm glow of a small overhead spotlight, it stood out with an understated elegance, its words clear and deliberate. "In honor of our veterans, especially Sergeant Major Elias Ford, we proudly offer a permanent 15% discount to all active duty military and veterans. Your service is never forgotten here." Below it, a modest bronze plaque bore Elias's name, etched with quiet reverence, alongside a simple phrase: "Respect is not a courtesy, it's a duty." The sign wasn't just a decoration, it was a statement, a promise, a quiet rebellion against indifference. Every customer who passed through those doors saw it. Some glanced at it out of habit, their eyes skimming the words as they hurried inside. Others paused, their steps slowing as the weight of the message settled in. A few removed their hats, their hands lingering in respect. Some, with a spark of recognition, raised their hands in a crisp salute, their gestures carrying the weight of gratitude and memory. This wasn't a corporate mandate, handed down from some distant boardroom. No, this was personal. Dana Whitmore, the store manager, who once moved through her days distracted, her mind tangled in schedules and sales targets, had been the one to push for it. Something had shifted in her, a change that felt like waking up after a long, restless sleep. It started with Gunny Torres's training session, where stories of sacrifice and service filled the room, cutting through the noise of her everyday concerns. But it was her private conversation with Elias Ford that truly cracked her open. His quiet dignity, the way he carried the weight of his years with a cane in one hand and a lifetime of service in his heart, stirred something deep within her. She saw not just a man, but a symbol of something larger, something she'd overlooked for too long. Guilt gnawed at her for the times she'd rushed past veterans in her store, their stories invisible to her busy eyes. Determination followed, a fierce resolve to do better, to make her store a place where gratitude wasn't just a word, but a living, breathing commitment. She made a public promise in a press release that rippled through local news. This store will always be known for its quality, but more than that, for how we honor those who have sacrificed for us. Her words weren't just rhetoric. They were a vow, one she carried in her chest every time she walked past that sign. Tyler Jensen, a young employee whose name never made the headlines, felt the change too. Once, he'd been just another face behind the counter, ringing up groceries with mechanical efficiency. But something in him had stirred too after that day. He began to notice the veterans who came through the doors, their weathered caps, their steady gazes, the medals pinned to jackets that told stories he'd never thought to ask about. Now, when a veteran entered, Tyler stood a little straighter, his posture a quiet nod to their presence. He didn't just memorize the shapes of medals out of obligation. He wanted to understand what they meant. The silver star, the bronze star, the purple heart, each one a chapter in a story of courage. Every week, without fanfare or a single post on social media, he dedicated hours to sorting donated goods for a local veteran shelter. It wasn't for recognition, it was for the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was part of something bigger, something that mattered. In his heart, he carried a growing respect, not just for the veterans, but for the part of himself he was discovering through their stories. The impact didn't stop at the store's walls. Word of what happened spread like wildfire through the town and beyond, carried by whispers and newsstands alike. A local newspaper captured the moment with a headline that stuck. General walks into market and teaches a lesson in honor. And the story went viral, shared thousands of times across military pages, veteran groups, and news outlets nationwide. At first, the attention was drawn to the drama, a retired general shutting down a store in a moment of righteous indignation. But what lingered, what truly resonated, was the heart behind it. Veterans from neighboring counties began making the trip, some to shake Elias Ford's hand, their grips firm with shared understanding. Others came simply to shop in a place where they felt seen, where their service wasn't just acknowledged, but celebrated. Parents brought their children, pointing to a new display near the register that rotated monthly, spotlighting different veterans from the community. It started with Elias, his story told in quiet words in a faded photograph, but it grew to include others, each one a reminder that heroes walked among them. The staff, too, began to change. They learned the difference between a silver star and a bronze star, not as a checklist, but as a way to connect with the people behind the medals. They practiced saying thank you for your service, with sincerity, letting the words carry the weight of genuine gratitude rather than rote politeness. For Elias, life continued, much as it always had. He still walked with his cane, still kept to his routines. Coffee at dawn, a slow stroll through town, the same grocery list he'd carried for years. But there was a lightness in him now, not because people finally noticed him, but because they noticed what he stood for. The respect he'd always carried in his bones was now reflected back at him, not just in words but in actions, in the way the town was learning to see its veterans. In a place that had grown accustomed to moving too fast, to overlooking the quiet ones, one moment of cruelty had sparked 1,000 acts of recognition. A single act of disrespect had opened the door to a deeper understanding, a reminder that gratitude isn't a fleeting gesture but a commitment. The story of Elias Ford became more than a headline. It grew into a local legend, a touchstone for a community rediscovering its moral compass. In a world that races forward, it's easy to forget the men and women who gave the best years of their lives in distant deserts and jungles, who returned not for applause but for the quiet hope of peace. Yet peace doesn't always greet them warmly. Sometimes it meets them with indifference or worse, disdain. When we stop honoring those who sacrificed, we lose more than tradition. We lose the reminder that freedom comes at a cost, paid in sweat, pain, and memory by people like Elias, whose medals are not mere trinkets, but echoes of battles most will never know. Those medals still carry weight, but do we still understand them? Do we teach our children what a bronze star represents, or why a Purple Heart is more than a mark of injury? It's a testament to someone who stood between danger and home, who chose duty over safety. Or have these symbols become mere decorations, glanced at and forgotten? This story isn't just about one man mocked or one general stepping in. It's about the quiet strength woven into every uniform, the battles fought long after the war ends, the dignity that demands our respect. It's a call to notice the unseen, to honor the silent heroes who walk among us, and to remember that honor doesn't wait for an invitation. It only needs someone brave enough to act.